Pretend for a moment that you hadn't seen the title of this video. Now pretend like we were just casually talking and I said something like, hey, I just played this really great indie Metroidvania game that I think that you should check out. You play as this small, pale protagonist exploring the ruins of a kingdom that was destroyed by a plague that turned all of the inhabitants into zombies. The game is really dark and somber in tone with excellent combat mechanics, memorable bosses, and a powerful atmosphere that permeates throughout every aspect of the game. Also, the protagonist has a bunch of, identical siblings who were all created specifically by a corrupt king to stop the spread of a plague, and there are multiple different endings, and most of the game takes place underground. Now, what game am I talking about? Most people are probably thinking, wow, how is this dude only just now playing Hollow Knight? Obviously, however, you have seen the title of this video, so you know that I'm actually talking about this magical little indie masterpiece that flew somewhat under the radar, Ender Lilies, Quietus of the Nights. The thing is, I'm not just making jokes when I say that this game is a lot like Hollow Knight. Just about everything in this game, the genre and the gameplay, the story and the way that it's told, the somber atmosphere, the cute monochrome protagonist, feels a lot like Hollow Knight. That's not, however, a bad thing. Hollow Knight was, in my opinion, an absolute masterpiece of a game, so the comparison can only be a compliment. Thankfully, there's much more to this game than just retreading the well-worn path of its more successful predecessor. So understand that as I talk about this game, I'm going to be using the phrase "like Hollow Knight" a lot. But ultimately, this isn't meant to be a comparison, for the purpose of saying that one is better than the other. Rather, my goal here is to show why someone who loves Hollow Knight as much as I do should consider giving Ender Lilies a try. Because while at the end of the day I do consider Hollow Knight to be the better game, Ender Lilies does enough that is unique and different that it makes this trek down the familiar Hollow Knight path feel unique and special all on its own. And hey, a retread of a great game would still be a great game. Much like Hollow Knight, Ender Lilies tells the tale of a broken, ruined kingdom devastated by a plague that turned its citizens into zombies. You play the role of Lily, a young girl and the last White Priestess. Without going into too much detail, White Priestesses are special in that they are the only line of defense against the blight that has ruined the land. They can use their powers to purify the blighted, purging the blight from off of their flesh, freeing their minds and allowing their souls to finally be put to rest. There's a twist here, though. One that sows another layer of tragedy throughout every moment of triumph in the game. Because purifying the blight does not mean getting rid of it. The priestesses take the blight from off of those who are infected and pull that infection into themselves. While they're safe from having their minds succumb to the disease like regular people, they still feel the pain of the corruption in their flesh, still feel their limbs gradually begin to go numb until finally their bodies rot away around them, the salvation they grant to others ultimately becoming their own damnation. Lily is awoken from her mysterious slumber by her protector, the Umbral Knight, an undead warrior who swore to serve her bloodline even in death, and as she is the last, he has now come to serve her. His is the only friendly face that she'll meet throughout her entire journey as they travel through the ruined kingdom, searching for any signs of Lily's mother, the priestess of the fount, fighting the zombie citizens and the knights who once served as her mother's protectors along the way, purifying them as they go and laying their souls to rest, the weight of their blight gradually accumulating within Lily. As you can imagine, there's a fair amount of tragedy here. The tale of what happened being told piecemeal through broken scraps of paper or the memories of those you purify as you slowly put together the sad tale of this doomed kingdom and Lily's tragic role within it. But as similar as the setup for this game is to Hollow Knight, it's in the execution and the characters where this game stands head and shoulders above its contemporaries. Both games don't exactly have a strong central narrative. You're meant to gradually piece together what's happened through random lines of dialogue, item descriptions, and the natural storytelling of the world itself as you progress through the game. But Ender Lilies has the advantage here in that the main story bosses, mini-bosses, and Lily herself get to have a lot more character than the ones in Hollow Knight, and this is largely thanks to the addition of multiple unmissable cutscenes. While there is still much that you can miss if you're not paying attention, these cutscenes create a much stronger through line for the narrative, tinged with the personal biases and tragedies of the individual characters, adding a lot of personality and charm. And I'd be remiss here not to mention Lily herself. I get that a large part of who and what the Hollow Knight is relies on them not having a personality. Because he's supposed to be hollow, he's the Hollow Knight, that's the whole point. But just because something is a certain way for a certain reason, that doesn't mean that it's suddenly immune to scrutiny. And in comparison, I just think Lily is a much more engaging protagonist. She's silent, just like the Knight, and small, and pale, but she's also fragile, and expressive, and scared. She never says a word, and it's implied that she maybe can't speak at all. But we get to see her courage as she literally shivers from fear, yet steps forward anyway to face the seemingly unending horror before her. We see her selflessness as, even suffering from the pain of the blight, she repeatedly puts forth her hand to save the mutated monsters who only moments before were trying to kill her. And we get to see how adorable she is when she hides behind the spirit she summons to aid her. I mean, just look at this. Look at the little dance shuffle thing that she does.
Cha-cha, real smooth.
What more even needs to be said? To clarify, I'm not saying that the Hollow Knight is a bad main character, not by any stretch of the imagination. But there are strengths present to the cast and the narrative of Ender Lilies that, while the central story is much the same, enables you to experience a similar story with an entirely new perspective. And I happen to think that this is one area where the game actually manages to excel above and beyond many of its contemporaries. Still, this is a video game, so gameplay should stand at the forefront. As a Metroidvania, a genre that has seen a heavy revival recently, especially in the indie sphere, and is basically inundated with clones, does Ender Lilies really do enough to stand out among its peers? The gameplay here is much the same as I'm sure most people would expect. It's a Metroidvania. You explore a bunch of different regions on a larger world map in 2D side-scroller glory, fighting enemies and bosses, getting power-ups and new movement skills to let you access areas you couldn't reach before, etc., etc. And I'm going to be upfront here. While the combat is great, I don't think it quite manages to stand up to Hollow Knight in this regard. A lot of what makes Hollow Knight so great is that the controls feel so quick and responsive. While you do gain extra skills, these are mostly movement related, and while the game isn't linear, the developers designed their boss encounters around which abilities you should reasonably have at the time that you encounter them, which allowed them to create tight encounters that can push you to the limit of your skills without ever feeling cheap or unfair. The combat in Ender Lilies is very different, however, and a lot of that comes down to arguably the biggest difference between both games. While Lily is the main character that you are controlling, Lily is not the one who is doing the fighting. Her spirits are. As you find and defeat bosses throughout the game, their spirits will join you on your quest, and Lily can summon them to fight off the Blighted. She doesn't actually do any of the fighting herself, however. As demonstrated before with her cute little jig, she actually sort of cowers as the spirit manifests itself beside her and performs its unique action. What this means is, the abilities you have, their hitboxes, the range and speed that they come out, and how many times you can use them, are all dependent on how much exploring you've done. This means your arsenal of attack options is considerably wider than in Hollow Knight, but conversely, this means that the bosses don't ever quite feel like the perfectly crafted experiences that you might see in other games. This doesn't mean that they're bad or anything, quite the contrary. The first few are a little on the easy side in my opinion, but some of the late game bosses, Julius, Hoenir, Olv, and Muriel, can be plenty challenging and plenty of fun. But I find that most of the challenge doesn't actually come from the boss's movesets, other than Muriel. Screw you, Muriel. But from Lily's more restrictive movement options. As I said before, Hollow Knight feels great to play because the controls are so quick and responsive. Lily, however, is not that. She always feels a bit slower than you would like, and for about half the game, her dodge is actually just her belly flopping out of the way and you don't move very far or very fast. Now, there is a narrative reason for this. Lily is a child, she's not a fighter. The souls of the dead that she's granted salvation fight for her on her behalf, but she is not some expert warrior, so her feeling a little awkward and clumsy is actually a genius-level gameplay and story integration moment, and I actually really like it. But just like with the criticism of the Hollow Knight's character before, just because something is designed in a certain way for a certain reason does not mean that it is immune to scrutiny. And while I can appreciate what they were doing here, it doesn't change the fact that Lily doesn't feel as good to control as many other game characters do. I do just want to clarify that she doesn't feel bad to play as. It's not like controlling her is some broken experience that hindered my enjoyment. You do get new movement abilities as you progress, and it doesn't take long to adapt to the controls here, but if I'm being fair, I just need to point this out. The only other thing I need to discuss here is the other staple of Metroidvania gameplay, backtracking for upgrades and hidden items. For some people, this is a sore point for the genre, but I'm happy to say that Ender Lilies does a lot to mitigate this potential pain point while still preserving the fun of exploring and discovering. Not only can you freely fast travel between save points, you can also pause the game at any time to return to the previous save point you visited. This means that if you get halfway to where you're trying to go to, only to realize that the area you're in doesn't actually connect in the way you thought it did, you don't have to walk all the way back, and I think that that's great. The other great thing they've done is with the world map. Now, I actually think the map design is kinda ugly, and it's not my favorite thing in the world, but they've added in this feature where not only can you see how many branching paths there are in any given area, the areas themselves will change color from blue to orange if you have found all of the hidden items there. This is not only an excellent feature for completionists, it's also great if you ever get yourself stuck and aren't sure where to go. Which can happen, as several of the bosses can be fought out of order, and if you get yourself lost in an area and you can't figure out how to proceed, just quick travel back to the save point and check your map. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about certain aspects of the game's presentation, because this is the one area where I can comfortably say that it readily beats Hollow Knight: the art and the music. The world of Ender Lilies is beautiful, even in ruin. As you explore, you'll stumble across multiple different regions, each one gloomy and somber and sad, yet each one a feast for the eyes as well. From candlelit catacombs to ruined tower tops to blight-infested fungal wastes, the frequent contrast between dull browns and grays against bright popping colors is always a spectacle to behold. And that's just in the actual gameplay. As mentioned before, this game has multiple cutscenes that will play out when you defeat a boss in future memories or when you arrive at a certain story beat. And while most are a little more than single animated images, each one is absolutely gorgeous and manages to perfectly encapsulate the stark contrast between Lily's cuteness and the tragic horror that surrounds her on all sides. And then there's the music. This OST is absolutely stunning, and it is such a delight to listen to. Most of the music you'll hear while exploring around features a single isolated piano, really capturing that feeling of isolation and loneliness. Although there are a few areas where occasionally that piano will be accompanied by the voice of a young girl singing, possibly Lily adding diegetically to the background music? The music in this game also does one of my favorite things that music in video games can do. It's dynamic and will change depending on where you are. Outside, it's normal, but if you go inside or in a cave, it suddenly changes to being played on chimes, and if you go underwater, it will distort appropriately. And then there's the boss themes. I love the boss themes, because again, they're dynamic and they change throughout the fight, growing more and more intense as the bosses themselves change up their moveset and become more dangerous and aggressive. Compare this earlier theme from the start of the boss fight to this changed theme as the boss enters its final stage and really steps up its game. Hollow Knight has good art, don't get me wrong, and while the music is simple and understated, it's certainly not bad by any stretch of the imagination. But if you ever need an example of the difference between a good and a great, it's right here. Hollow Knight's visuals and OST are good. Ender Lilies are great. In conclusion, Ender Lilies is a beautifully tragic and somber game, featuring an adorably pure and sweet protagonist traveling through a picturesque and nightmarish world, one sporting a stellar soundtrack and some fun and compelling gameplay. If you love Hollow Knight, or have any interest at all in solid Metroidvanias, then allow me to highly suggest that you give this one a try. At the moment of recording, you can buy it on the Switch or on Steam for $25, which is more than Hollow Knight, granted, but to be fair, Ender Lilies is barely a year old, so maybe this is one area that we shouldn't be comparing them. I guess I'll wrap this up nice and tight by saying that if I gave Hollow Knight a 9 out of 10, I'd give Ender Lilies a solid 8. And hey, the developers recently confirmed that there is more Ender Lilies content on the way. Whether that means a sequel or DLC to expand the main game, I don't know. But considering how great the main game was, I can earnestly say that I am really looking forward to what else they have in store. But that's all for now. Keep it zesty.